Welcome back to Tales of the Dark. The story you're about to hear happened during the global lockdown in 2020, when most people were forced to stay inside their homes for weeks at a time. For one person living alone in a small apartment building, the isolation of that period made something strange happening nearby even more disturbing. The person who shared this story had recently moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood just a few weeks before the lockdown began. At first, the building seemed normal. It had only 8 apartments in total, with 2 units on each floor. Most of the residents were older people who kept to themselves. When the lockdown started, the building became incredibly quiet. Nobody left their apartments unless they absolutely had to. Hallways stayed empty most of the day, and the only sounds usually came from televisions or occasional footsteps above or below. The person telling this story lived on the 2nd floor. Above them was another apartment that appeared to be occupied by a man who rarely left his unit. In fact, during the first 2 weeks of lockdown, the storyteller never actually saw him face to face. The only sign that someone lived there was the occasional sound of footsteps moving across the ceiling late at night. At first, those noises didn't seem strange. After all, everyone was home all day because of the lockdown. But after a while, the sounds began happening at very unusual hours. Almost every night, right around 3 a.m., the person upstairs would start walking around the apartment. Not normal walking, either it was slow, deliberate pacing, back and forth across the same part of the floor. Sometimes it would last for an hour. Other nights, it would continue until sunrise. The storyteller tried to ignore it at first. But when you're stuck inside the same 4 walls every day during a global lockdown, small, repetitive details like that start to really stand out. They burrow into your brain. Eventually, curiosity got the better of them. One afternoon, while checking the mail in the lobby, they looked at the list of apartment numbers next to the mailboxes. Apartment 3, with a unit directly above theirs, had a name label that looked old and faded. The name printed there was R. Harlow, but something about the label just looked off. The paper was yellowed and worn, as if it had been there for many, many years without ever being replaced. Later that evening, the storyteller mentioned the upstairs neighbor to the building manager during a phone call about a maintenance issue. The manager paused for a moment before responding. "Which apartment?" he asked. When they told him 3B, there was another brief silence on the line. Then he said something that made the situation feel deeply unsettling. According to him, apartment 3B had been vacant for nearly 6 months. The previous tenant had moved out long before the lockdown even started. At first, the storyteller assumed the manager must have been mistaken. After all, someone was clearly walking around in the apartment above them every single night. But the manager insisted the unit had not been rented again yet. He was sure of it. That night, the footsteps started again, right on schedule at 3 a.m. That slow, heavy pacing back and forth across the ceiling. This time, however, listening with this new, disturbing information in mind, the storyteller noticed something they hadn't realized before. The footsteps never reached the far side of the apartment. They only moved across a small section of the floor, over and over again. As if the person upstairs was pacing inside a single room, trapped. The next night, curiosity finally turned into real concern. Around 2:50 a.m., the storyteller quietly stepped into the hallway outside their apartment and walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway was completely dark except for a faint emergency light near the exit door, casting long, spooky shadows. Apartment 3B sat at the far end of the corridor. The door looked old and was slightly scratched near the handle. When they stood outside the door, they could clearly hear movement from inside the apartment. Slow footsteps crossing the floor, back and forth, back and forth. The sound was much clearer now, much more real. Taking a deep breath, the storyteller raised their hand and knocked on the door gently. The footsteps stopped immediately. The entire hallway fell completely, unnervingly silent. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, from the other side of the door, someone knocked back. The knock echoed in the dead quiet hallway. Not a frantic knock, but a single, deep, solid thud that vibrated through the wood and into my own knuckles, which were still pressed against the surface. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. The manager had been so certain. Mrs. Gable, the landlady, had confirmed it herself just last week. "No one's been in or out of 3B since Mr. Harlow left," she'd said. Yet someone or something had just knocked back. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the door, at the tarnished brass 3B, and the empty peephole, a dark, unblinking eye in the gloom. My mind raced, desperately trying to find a logical explanation. A squatter? No, the building was secure, and Mrs. Gable was meticulous about checking the empty units. A prank? Who would risk breaking lockdown for such a lame, cruel joke? The silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear anything, nothing, just the faint hum of my own refrigerator from my apartment downstairs. After what felt like an eternity, I crept back to my own apartment, locked the deadbolt, and leaned against the door, my whole body trembling. The noises hadn't started with the footsteps. Now that I thought about it, they had started more subtly a few weeks into the lockdown. A faint scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across a bare floor. I'd dismissed it as the old building settling, or my own mind playing tricks on me in the intense isolation. Then came the whispers. So faint at first, I thought it was the wind whistling through a crack in the window, or a faulty pipe. But they grew more distinct over time, weaving in and out of the silence of the night, too rhythmic to be random. That night, sleep was completely out of the question. I sat on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the ceiling, at the shared wall. Every creak of my building, every distant siren, sent a jolt of pure terror through me. I thought about the name on the mailbox, our Harlow. He was an enigma, a quiet older man who kept to himself. In the few weeks I lived here before the lockdown, I'd only seen him a handful of times, a fleeting figure in the hallway, always dressed in a dated tweed coat, no matter the weather. He had a gaunt face and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He'd moved out abruptly a month before the city shut down. Leaving behind most of his belongings, Mrs. Gable had complained about the cost of having to clear it all out. The next day, the lockdown felt less like a safety measure and more like a cage. The silence from 3B was unnerving. Was it over, or was it just waiting? My curiosity, now laced with a heavy dose of dread, was gnawing at me. I needed to know what was going on. I found Mrs. Gable's number and called her. "Mrs. Gable," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me from 2B. I need to ask you about apartment 3B again. I heard a knock from inside last night." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "That's impossible, dear," she finally said, her voice strained and thin. "The door's been double-bolted from the outside ever since we finished clearing it. I have the only key." Double-bolted from the outside? My stomach churned. That meant whatever was in there was truly locked in. Or it didn't need a door to get in and out. "What? What did you find when you cleared it out?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She sighed, a weary, crackling sound through the phone. "Not much of value. Old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and his paintings. So many paintings. I'd never known he was an artist." "What kind of paintings?" "Strange ones," she said, her voice dropping lower, conspiratorially. "Portraits, mostly, but the faces." "They were all wrong?" The eyes were just dark smudges like empty sockets. "And they all looked hungry, gave me the creeps." We threw them all out, of course. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just random sounds anymore. I could almost make out a word, a name, repeated over and over. A dry, rasping hiss that seemed to slither right through the walls. Harlow, Harlow. It sounded like someone trying to speak with a throat full of dust. Then came a new sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Not on the door this time, but on the shared wall between our apartments. Tap, tap, tap. It started in the corner of my living room and slowly, methodically, began to travel along the wall toward my bedroom. I scrambled off the couch, backing away as the sound crept closer. It was pacing me. I fled to my bedroom, slammed the door shut, and huddled in the farthest corner, pulling the covers over my head like a terrified child. The tapping continued, moving along the wall outside my bedroom. Now, tap, tap. It stopped right behind my headboard. And then a new sound began. Scratching. A frantic, desperate scratching, as if something with long, sharp nails was trying to claw its way through the plaster to get to me. I didn't move until the sun came up. The scratching had stopped with the first light of dawn. Exhausted and terrified, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed a bag, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it. I had to get out. As I stood by my front door, ready to flee, I glanced through my peephole one last time. A final check. The hallway was empty. But something was different. Tucked under the door of apartment 3B was a small, folded piece of paper. Against all reason, against every self-preservation instinct in my body, I had to see what it was. My heart pounding, I cracked open my door, snatched the paper, and slammed it shut again, bolting it instantly. It was old and yellowed, a page torn from a sketchbook. On it was a charcoal drawing, a portrait. It was me, my face sketched with terrifying accuracy, but my eyes were just dark, empty, hungry smudges. I flipped the paper over. A single, spidery sentence was scrawled on the back. "I'm so glad you're my new neighbor." And then I heard it. From right behind my own front door, from my side of the hallway, a soft, familiar knock, thud, thud. It wasn't coming from 3B anymore. It was here. It was with me. I backed away from the door, my scream caught in my throat. I looked at the drawing again, at the hollowed-out eyes staring back at me. I finally understood. Mr. Harlow never really left. He was just looking for a new home. And he'd finally found one. The knocking continued, patient and steady. There was nowhere left for me to run. The lockdown wasn't keeping me safe from the world outside. It was trapping me inside with him. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. Stay safe out there and always check on your neighbors. You never know who or what might be living next door. The manager tried to dismiss it, saying it must have been the last tenant, but the dust was too fresh. There was no way those tracks were months old. He quickly locked up the apartment, and we went back downstairs. He promised he'd ask the cleaning crew about it, but his face looked pale. He didn't believe his own excuse, and neither did I that night. I sat in my living room, staring at the ceiling, just waiting. The silence was almost worse than the noise. My apartment, which once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, with me trapped right under whatever was happening upstairs. I tried to watch a movie, read a book, anything to distract myself, but my ears were straining, listening for the inevitable. And sure enough, just after 3 a.m., it started. The slow, rhythmic thud of footsteps, thud, 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 back and forth directly above me. It sounded heavier this time, more deliberate. My blood ran cold. Knowing the room above me was empty, seeing those footprints in the dust, it made the sound 100 times more terrifying. Who was walking up there, and how? I couldn't sleep. The next day I was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and caffeine. I had to know more. I called the building manager again, but this time I didn't ask about the noise. I asked about the previous tenant of 3B. He was hesitant at first, citing privacy concerns, but I was persistent. I told him I wouldn't stop calling until he gave me something. Finally, he sighed and told me what little he knew. The last tenant was a young man, a writer, who had lived there for about a year. He was quiet, kept to himself. The manager mentioned that the man had moved out abruptly a few months ago. He didn't give any notice. Just packed up and left in the middle of the night. He left the key on the counter and was gone. He even forfeited his security deposit. Weird guy, the manager said. Always seemed a bit stressed. Stressed? The word hung in the air. That night, the pacing started earlier, around midnight. It was faster now, more agitated. It wasn't just a slow walk anymore. It was a frantic, relentless stride. Back and forth, back and forth. I could almost feel the vibration through the floorboards. I lay in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. What was he so stressed about? What was he trying to walk off? Desperate for answers, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I started searching online. I looked up the building's address, old news articles, public records, anything I could find. It took hours digging through digital archives, but then I found it. An obscure blog post from 2 years ago, written by someone who claimed to have lived in my building, in apartment 4B, directly above the empty apartment. The post was titled, "The Walker." The author described the exact same thing, the sound of constant, endless pacing from the apartment below them, 3B. They wrote about how it drove them crazy, how they complained to management, how they confronted the tenant, a different person back then, who swore they weren't making any noise. The blog author eventually moved out, unable to stand the psychological torment of the phantom footsteps. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just about the recent tenant. This had been happening for years. The sound was tied to the apartment itself. Driven by a mix of fear and a strange, obsessive need to understand, I decided to take things a step further. I knew the manager wouldn't give me the key again. So I waited until the following weekend, when I knew he was off duty. I had spent the week listening to that frantic pacing every night, feeling my own sanity start to fray. I bought a cheap lock-picking kit online. I'd never done it before, but after watching a few tutorials, I felt just brave enough or foolish enough to try. Late that Saturday night, after the pacing had begun, I crept upstairs. My hands were shaking as I stood in front of the door to 3B. The hallway was dark and silent, except for the muffled, rhythmic thud coming from inside. Thud. 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 It was so much clearer now, standing right outside the door. I pulled out the small metal tools and got to work. My heart was a drum against my ribs. Every tiny click of the lock seemed to echo down the hall. It felt like an eternity, but finally I heard a satisfying clink. The lock turned. I slowly pushed the door open. The stale, dusty smell hit me again, but this time it was mixed with something else. An almost electric charge in the air, a feeling of deep, profound sadness. The living room was bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights from the window. And there, in the middle of the room, was the source of the sound. It was a man, or the translucent, shimmering outline of a man. He was dressed in simple, old-fashioned clothes. He was pale, almost gray, and his face was locked in an expression of intense concentration and anxiety. He didn't see me, he didn't seem to see anything. He just walked. He paced that same narrow path, his spectral feet passing silently over the floorboards, yet somehow producing that heavy, audible thud I heard every night. His path took him from one end of the room to the other. When he reached the far wall, he would simply turn and walk back. He was trapped in a loop, a prisoner of his own endless walk. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was witnessing something deeply tragic. This wasn't a monster. It was a lost soul. A ghost, stuck, repeating the same anxious moments he endured in life. Maybe he was the writer, waiting for inspiration that never came. Or a tenant from long before, waiting for a loved one who never returned. It didn't matter. All that was left was the walk. I watched him for what felt like hours. His ghostly form flickered, his expression never changing, back and forth. Back and forth. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slowly, quietly backed out of the room and pulled the door shut, the lock clicking softly behind me. I didn't run. I walked back to my apartment in a daze. That night, lying in bed, the sound from above didn't terrify me in the same way. It was still unsettling, but now it was layered with a deep sense of pity. I was listening to a man's eternal torment. The nights that followed were the same. The pacing continued, a constant, ghostly metronome marking the time. I thought about moving, but a strange thing happened. I got used to it. The sound became a part of my life, a grim companion in the quiet of the night. It was my secret. The secret of apartment 3B. But then, about a month later, something changed. I was woken up not by the pacing, but by the silence. It was 3:30 a.m., and for the first time in months, there was no sound from upstairs. I lay awake, listening, but there was nothing. Just the normal creaks and groans of an old building. The silence stretched on for the rest of the night, and the next night, and the night after that. The pacing had stopped. I should have been relieved. I should have been thrilled. But I wasn't. The silence felt wrong, unnatural. The quiet was louder than the footsteps had ever been. A week went by with no sound. Maybe I thought he had finally found peace. Maybe my witnessing him had somehow broken the loop. I started to relax, to believe it was over. Then last night I was jolted awake. It was just after 3 a.m., but it wasn't the sound of pacing that woke me. It was a new sound, a different sound. 3 slow, deliberate taps. It wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from my own living room, from the other side of my front door. I froze, my body rigid with a new kind of terror. I held my breath and listened. Silence, and then again tap, tap, tap. Someone was at my door. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it wasn't the building manager. After a long, terrifying pause, I heard a faint sound, a floorboard creaking, but it wasn't from the hallway outside my door. The sound came from inside my apartment, from the far side of my own living room, and then I heard it. A slow, heavy footstep, thud, and another thud. It wasn't coming from above me anymore. It was in the room with me. His walk hadn't ended. He had just changed apartments. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Stay safe out there. I've always been a bit of a night owl, but these past few weeks have been different. It started subtly. A creak here, a groan, they're the usual sounds of an old apartment building settling in for the night. I'd chalked it up to old pipes or the wind. But then came the footsteps. It was the fourth night in a row, and I was lying awake, staring at my ceiling, waiting. My clock read 2:59 a.m. I held my breath. Right on cue, as the numbers clicked over to 3 o'clock, the pacing began. It was always the same. A slow, deliberate tread, back and forth right above my bedroom. The floorboards of the apartment upstairs, 3B, complained with each step. At first, I thought it was just my new neighbor. Maybe they worked a late shift, had insomnia, or a strange exercise routine. I tried to be understanding. I left a polite note mentioning the noise and asking if they could maybe wear slippers. The note disappeared from their door, but the pacing continued, unchanged. I even talked to Mrs. Gable and Tua. She's lived here for 30 years and knows everything about everyone. When I mentioned the new tenant in 3B, she gave me a strange look. New tenant? Honey, that apartment's been empty for months. Ever since the last one. Well, ever since he left. She wouldn't say more, just shook her head and hurried off. That's when the first real chill snaked down my spine. Empty? By the fifth night, my patience had worn thin and my nerves were shot. The pacing felt heavier tonight, more insistent. It wasn't just walking anymore. It was a patrol. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't work. The sound was burrowing into my brain. I had to do something. So, I grabbed a heavy flashlight from my kitchen drawer and headed for the door. My heart was a drum against my ribs as I stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The building was dead silent, except for that relentless rhythm from above. I crept up the stairs, each step of mine echoing my own heartbeat. The air grew colder as I approached the third floor. The hallway was empty, shadows clinging to the corners. The only light was a single, flickering bulb that cast long, dancing shapes on the peeling wallpaper. I stood there, right outside 3B, listening. The footsteps were loud now, right on the other side of the door, back and forth, back and forth. It sounded like someone wearing heavy boots, dragging their feet slightly with each step. Curiosity and a healthy dose of anger pushed me forward. I raised my fist and knocked, 3 loud, firm raps on the wood. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. It was more unnerving than the noise had been. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything. A minute passed. Nothing. Maybe they finally got the message. I was about to turn away, a small victory in my chest, when I heard it. A new sound, a dry, scratching noise, like fingernails dragging slowly across the inside of the door. It started at the bottom and worked its way up, getting closer and closer to the peephole. I instinctively backed away. The scratching stopped right at eye level. Then the doorknob began to jiggle. It wasn't a frantic shake, but a slow, methodical turn, as if a weak hand was struggling to get a grip. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move. I was completely frozen. Then a voice whispered from the other side. It was a hoarse, ragged sound like dry leaves scraping against pavement. It said just 4 words, but they echoed in the cavern of my soul. You shouldn't be here? That broke the spell. Pure, primal fear took over. I scrambled backwards, tripping over my own feet. The doorknob finally clicked, and the lock disengaged. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I fled. I bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back until I reached the safety of the second-floor landing. And that's when I made my mistake. I glanced up. The door to 3B was wide open. Standing in the darkened doorway was a figure. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly touching the top of the doorframe. And it was thin, unnaturally thin, a skeletal silhouette against the blackness of the apartment. I couldn't make out any features, just its long, distorted shape. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I slammed my own door shut, locked it, and threw the deadbolt, my whole body trembling. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat on my couch with every light in my apartment on, listening. But there were no more footsteps. The silence was complete. The next morning I knew I had to leave. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The front door was bolted, chained, and I even shoved a chair under the knob, but none of it mattered. It wasn't about keeping something out. It was about what was already in. My laptop screen was a blinding beacon in the dark apartment, my fingers flying across the keyboard, typing every frantic combination of words I could think of. Tall, thin shadow in hallway, pacing figure. Unnatural silence. Most results were just junk creepy stories, fake videos. But my blood ran cold when I saw it. Buried deep in a forum about forgotten local folklore, a thread from years ago titled, "Has anyone ever seen the Echo Walker?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked. The post was short, disjointed, written by someone who sounded as terrified as I felt. They described a tall, thin creature, a shadow that paced, drawn to places saturated with sorrow and loneliness. My apartment, the place where I'd grieved alone for so long. The legend said it was an emotional parasite, feeding on the lingering pain left behind. It walks and walks, a spectral echo of misery. The more you notice it, the more you acknowledge its presence, the more real it becomes, it solidifies. The forum posts devolved into panic, with users claiming the original poster had just disappeared. My breath hitched. Further down, I found a link to a digitized archive of local history. It was a scanned page from a decaying book, filled with crude, ancient drawings. There it was. The impossibly long limbs, the featureless head, the hunched posture. It was an exact match for the figure from my hallway. The text below the drawing was almost unreadable, but I could make out a few chilling words. To see it is to be seen. To know it is to be bound. A horrifying realization washed over me. I wasn't just haunted, I was being claimed. The air in the room grew heavy, colder, and then, from down the hall, I heard it. A slow, deliberate footstep. It had stopped pacing. It was coming for me. I started packing, throwing my belongings into boxes with frantic energy. But I had to know, I had to see. With the morning sun streaming through the hallway windows, I felt a little braver. I convinced myself it was all a waking nightmare, a product of sleep deprivation. I went back upstairs. The door to 3B was closed again, just as it had been. I pushed it gently. It swung open on silent hinges, revealing the apartment. It was completely empty. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light pouring through the dirty windows. There was no furniture, no boxes, nothing to indicate anyone had lived there for a very, very long time. The floor was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, undisturbed except for one set of footprints. They were long, narrow prints leading from the hallway to the center of the living room, and then back and forth, in that same relentless path I had heard for so many nights. And then I saw the writing. In the middle of the room, scratched into the thick dust on the floor, was a message. The letters were jagged and crude, as if drawn by a trembling finger. It wasn't just a message, it was a declaration. 2 simple, terrifying sentences. "You can't leave. I live here now." My gaze lifted from the floor, and I looked at my own dusty reflection in the grimy window. But behind my reflection, just for a second, I saw another shape. Tall and thin, standing right behind me. I spun around. The room was empty, but I could feel it. A cold presence, a sense of being watched. I backed out of the room, not taking my eyes off the spot where the figure had stood. As I pulled the door shut, I heard a faint whisper from inside, a sound like dry leaves rustling. It sounded like my name. Now, as I'm telling you this, I'm sitting in my own living room, surrounded by packed boxes, but I haven't left. I can't. Every time I touch the doorknob, I feel an icy coldness spread through my hand. And every night at 3 a.m., I don't hear the footsteps from upstairs anymore. I hear them from right outside my own bedroom door, pacing, waiting, and sometimes, very faintly, I hear that scratching. and I know it's only a matter of time before the doorknob starts to turn. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Stay safe out there.